Welcome to episode 2 of Kerusi Panas. We're going to start in the heart of the country, in Kelantan, in a parliamentary constituency of Gua Musang. And I know these are a state election, so why you're asking yourself, why is she focusing on a parliamentary constituency? It's because all 3 seats in this parliamentary constituency are very hot. Paloh, Ninggiri, and Galas. Gua Musang is at the center, bordering Pahang, Perak, and Terengganu. The constituency as a whole, which covers these 3 state seats, is 8,174 square kilometers. It gives you a sense of the size. It's one of the largest in Peninsular Malaysia. Gua Musang is over 350 kilometers away from Kuala Lumpur, especially long when you count the kilometers when you're driving. Had profound changes. It used to be a very small town. Now it has grown in terms of development, facilities. There's much more settlement. People are moving there. Used to be that people would leave from Gua Musang. Now people are going back to settle because of availability of land and the attraction for younger families. You can see and feel that there are centers. Things are not as quiet. It's hopping. It's a rural seat, but it has increasingly become more semi-urban in some of its facilities, especially around the town in Bandar Lama. Gua Musang has and is a place of legend. The Orang Asli community make up 13% of the overall population, and in some of the seats they actually make up almost a quarter of the voters, such as that in Galas. But they're also the ones that help to shape the name and the history of this particular area. The town and the name means a cave of civet cats. And in the town, you see these huge limestone caves that are split. The train station is between them. There's a legend that the caves have power. Many years ago, hunters heard and saw the musang, the civet cats, disappear, and they went up looking for them to try to hunt for them. They came back, couldn't find them the first time, came back, went back and saw these stairs and started to walk up these stairs and drank the water. Most of the hunters disappeared, 6 out of 7. Only 1 came home, the one that didn't drink. Why am I telling you this story about Gua Musang and the issues of disappearance? It's because this particular area will determine whether or not UMNO as a party disappears in the place of political politics in Kelantan. It is the real last remaining competitive seats for the party in this state. Many people in politics know of Gua Musang because of the longest-serving member of parliament. Tunku Rizali served in this particular constituency from 1974 to 2022, 10 different terms. Before 1986, the constituency was known as Ulu Kelantan, but he was ousted by a mere 163 votes, although the score sheet has a slightly different number, but the one that was reported was 163. All of the seats in this particular constituency are very hot. I visited this area the week before nomination. Logistically, in terms of doing the series, I wanted to give it its due, and it takes a long time to get there. The campaign was already in full swing. There were even traffic jams due to the fact that, by coincidence, I visited the day that Anwar Ibrahim, the Prime Minister, and the Deputy Prime Minister, Zahid Hamidi, were actually visiting the area, particularly in Paloh. And I think their visits are an illustration and a recognition of the competitiveness of these 3 seats for UMNO and for the Pakatan Harapan and the unity government as a whole. In each of these seats, there are straight fights between the Barisan Nasional and Perikatan Nasional. All of these seats have UMNO incumbents, but they will face off their challengers. 2 of the candidates will face off against Bersatu and 1 in PAS. The candidates themselves reflect some of the diversity and the nature of politics in a place like Gua Musang and in the politics of Kelantan. In Ninggiri, you have Abdul Aziz Yusof, who is one of the oldest candidates contesting at 63. He gets his legitimacy from his work looking at areas of the Ministry of Rural Development. When he talks about his work and it publishes about what he's done, the focus is on providing assistance to the Orang Asli, helping to bring about development in areas in terms of dam construction and other particular features in terms of building telecommunications and digital technology. And what's interesting is that while there were some spots that there were no internet, we can also see that the digital connectivity has really profoundly changed. He will run against a member of Bersatu. And it's interesting what's happening here. The man, Muhammad Azizi Abu Naim, who's 52, he was the person who was the giant killer in Gua Musang. He was the one who toppled Tunku Rizali Hamza in the incumbent seat at Parliament. But as many of you who've been following politics in Gua Musang will know, that the parliamentary constituency is being contested in court and that it's still an ongoing petition. But the question will become whether or not Azizi, who is the elected member of parliament right now, will still retain that seat. The chances are, given the decision so far, that this will be a seat that they will actually go to a new election like Kuala Terengganu is doing. So Azizi is hedging his bets and running against the UMNO contender. In Paloh, you have the incumbent Amran Arafan, also from UMNO, a little bit younger at 47. He's an ustaz, but he's also been a special officer in the Deputy Prime Minister's office, which is, of course, Zahid. He has been the chairman of the Kelantan Youth, and he, of course, is seen as comes from the area and local roots. He's running against a Bersatu candidate who was also a former UMNO representative in the area, a man called Shari bin Mat Hussein, who's 62. He was the vice president of the Kelantan Football Association, and he represents what we see of a lot of Bersatu candidates, which they are old UMNO politicians trying to have a second life through connections through Perikda Nasional. Paloh, of the three different seats, is perhaps the most Felda in a traditional way. You have many different Felda areas like Aring and different Kampung Paloh areas. When you go in, you can see there's still considerable and massive palm oil. The areas are not as populated as before. I met with a number of people in these communities in the Felda areas, and they talk about the fact that many of them live in town or that there's been less presence compared to the past. So there's been a kind of relocation of some of the population within Gua Musang itself. But the seat that I think is arguably, to me, one of the most interesting of the three is Gallas. And here Muhammad Shabuddin Hashim, who is the youngest candidate of all of these seats at 44, he has been a number of terms in this position. He is seen as a very on-the-ground politician. He's the chairman of the Kelantan Youth Council. He works on issues of youth clubs. He's known for recording his personal experience when he was affected with COVID, talks about this in his book. When we speak to voters in Gallas, they know who he is, and they see that he's around as someone who makes a point to be present for the community. He is going against a ustaz, a Muhammad Tarmizi bin Abdul Rahman, who's 47, so also relatively young. Ustaz G, as he's known, is born in Pasir Mas, is a popular religious teacher, having trained and graduated at Al-Azhar University and taught in Gua Musang and Kelantan. His ustaz credentials are seen to be quite significant, and this is where you have this kind of local, grounded UMNO politician working hard, connecting into the areas of the community, being challenged by an ustaz who also has significant credibility through his religious connections and through his religious standing, and they're facing off against each other. And here's where, in a place like Gallas, we would think about this as a rural constituency, but in fact, it is very dynamic in terms of the TikTok campaign. The people are connected in very meaningful ways. So you can see the campaign is not just personal, and it is also through social media. And this is something that's really transformed in Malaysian politics. You have the local campaigning of personal ties and patronage has shifted into a much more discussion about personalities and positions, at least in terms of how they stand with representing different parties and different communities. There are a few things that I look at in analyzing this particular set of constituencies because it's really fascinating to see how the voting patterns have changed and what might happen in the coming polls. We see of the two seats in Paloh and Nenggiri, we saw a much more competitive and shift in voting patterns. The voting pattern changes happened particularly among younger voters, and we can see that the parliamentary contest, Tunku Rizali did not do as well among younger voters. The voters I spoke to said that he'd been there too long, that they didn't see him. They had a sense of no connectivity, even though he still has considerable standing. It's interesting also, he has a new mosque, a very beautiful mosque that has been constructed in the town of Gua Musang, over where an older mosque used to be. Now, in looking at voting patterns, there are three groups that I kind of focus in on. The first of which is the youth vote. So around 37% of the voters in Gua Musang, distributed across these three seats, are under the age of 30. In Galas, that's 40%. So it's one of the highest seats in the country that have a lot of younger voters. So we can see that this is really, in many ways, a youth battle, a kind of proxy for really how youth are supporting the PN or BN from a perspective of what's on offer in this area. And we can see when I talk to younger families, the issues of young people are not discussing religion, although that is to a certain degree still quite important for some voters, but also the issues of the cost of living and the questions of development. I sat down with three different families, and there was a tension and differences about whether or not they felt who deserved the record and the blame for the challenges of development in Gua Musang. All of them talked about wanting something different, something new. You can see the optimism, the sense of expectations. This is an electorate, a young electorate with high levels of demands, and you can see some of the conflict. The conflict came from traditional family loyalties, the perceptions of the candidate or the different candidates, or the sense of the direction of whether or not this was going to be a local versus a national election. And many of them, in their priorities, was focusing on what does it mean for Gua Musang? Who's going to do the best job for us here, not nationally, but us here. The second group that I focused to talk to were the Chinese voters. They're much smaller in number and becoming smaller from a demographic shift that's taking place. The Chinese have always been very important in Gua Musang because there's been a new village. In the 1940s and early 50s, the struggle for the communists and between the government and the communists was very intense in the area of Gua Musang. So there's a long history of the importance of the struggle and the issues of the connections to the idea of the new village and the community there. The Chinese are involved and have traditionally been involved in the local businesses, which have been historically timber, and there still is a lot of logging taking place in Gua Musang. The Chinese population, especially the older voters, were adamant in how they expressed their views. They said, UMNO, 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 usually 3 times in some cases. Their views were fixed. I asked many of them if they had voted for Pakatan Harapan before, and Pakatan Harapan only won about 17% of the vote, and some of them had. And so I asked them, will you be moving your vote? Will you cross over? And this is what's interesting, is that the crossover from Chinese voters, from Pakatan Harapan voters to UMNO is extremely important for UMNO in a seat like this, and this in all 3 seats. And for the majority, there wasn't a single person that I spoke to, but I'm sure there will be some, that were not willing to cross over at this particular juncture. So what we do see in a small town and some rural seats, where especially the small town where the Chinese population is concentrated, you see a high level of willingness to cross over. And it was pretty clear the reasons for it. It was about, trying to continue to build development for the constituency. They also felt a disconnect with the past government from the perspective of representation and inclusion in terms of how they expressed it. As these areas have changed and the Felda areas have changed, we're also seeing shifts that are happening within the other very important community that shapes voting in Gua Musang, and that is the Orang Asli. The Orang Asli communities are made up of 4 different major groups, the Jahai, the Timiar, the Mendrig, and the Batik. But they are also concentrated across these areas, particularly in Negeri and Galas. In Galas, for example, they make up 26% of the vote, which gives you a sense of the power of the Orang Asli and the significance of that vote. It's not a coincidence that when Anwar and Zahid visited Gua Musang, they also went to Orang Asli areas. The attention to the community in a seat like Gua Musang, in these 3 different seats, also brings attention to the issues of the Orang Asli community. And we cannot step away from the reality that the conditions that the Orang Asli are facing, higher levels of poverty, challenges of livelihood, questions of religious conversion, cultural clashes in terms of understanding, the challenges of logging, the challenges of management of the land. Gua Musang has been a place of intense contestation between the Orang Asli community as with the state and federal government over sets of issues. Recently, there was a case involving missing children where 5 children died. 7 of them had been missing for 46 or 47 days, as I recall. It was illustrative of some of the challenges of education, the culture classes, and the misunderstandings that exist, and the negligence that exists with the treatment for the Orang Asli communities in places such as Gua Musang. These 3 groups, the Chinese, the Orang Asli, and the youth vote, which is disproportionately comprised of the Malay community, I think will be decisive in shaping what happens in these 3 seats. Of course, the candidate factors will come in as well. I think the voting patterns in Galas show some very interesting findings in that there was very little change in vote between 2018 and 2022, which indicates that the UMNO candidate there has the best chance. It was the changes in the other 2 seats that actually you saw the biggest shift in voting patterns. YB Shabudin has seen a fighting chance. While Azizi, who is from Bersatu and contesting at Ninggiri, is in some ways has the strongest chance for PN. He's playing his chances because the chances of having to lose the parliamentary petition would mean that he would still be a representative even if it's at the state level. Based on the voting patterns, looking at both youth voting patterns and the shifts at the local levels, one can see that he would have that advantage. And although voters in the Felda areas still had expressed strong loyalties to UMNO, even though the increasingly more did talk about turning to PN. But many of them were interesting in the Felda communities. There was a lot more indecision. And this is something to keep in mind, is that the perceptions from outside is that voters are confirmed in how they're voting. But I think that many of the voters were still reflecting and thinking about this election and not necessarily fully committed to what they voted in the past. They were looking and assessing to vote for the present and the future. The legend of Gua Musang said that the people who went up the hill disappeared. We will see whether or not in Gua Musang, UMNO disappears as a political force in Kelantan. This crossroad areas, this hopping, very bustling now crossroads areas, may in fact actually give UMNO a bit of life, potentially in Galas. But whatever happens, the shift that's taken place here, the profound political shift, shows that there is a long road ahead for the parties to continue to strengthen and to grow. Thanks for joining here on episode 2. This is Bridget Welsh with Kerusi Panas. I look forward to speaking with you on the next episode.